Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Boundaries and Belonging podcast, an arts-based approach. I'm your host, Magdalena Karlick.
You need all the voices.
To recognize someone's truth doesn't mean you have to invalidate somebody else's.
No one knows everything, including the instructor.
As educators, how do we support the experience of belonging in our classrooms?
When you allow yourself to be as human as possible, that's when you can really connect.
You are welcome to challenge where the edges are.
When I'm in the classroom, I'm going to be who I am.
My responsibility is to push the boundaries of what we know and what we do.
This is the Boundaries and Belonging podcast, where I interview educators from around the United States who are teaching the next generation of arts-based therapists. Hi, everybody. I am really excited, interested, and a little nervous about this episode. I am here with Sam Haid, who is a licensed counselor and a nationally registered art therapist located in Colorado. And you are the founder of Infinite Real, a private practice supporting LGBTQIA+++ folks in Colorado and New Mexico. And we have, I think, a special relationship. You are a former student of mine and have been a supervisee for years now. You're going to interview me today, and I am excited. I'm excited. Thank you so much for agreeing to this, for being here, and for being you.
I'm super happy to be here and really honored that you wanted me to be a part of this process.
Yes, I think that we really have great conversations and a great rapport. So this feels good.
Yay. And I've listened to all of the preceding podcasts and episodes, so I definitely understand the intention behind, or at least I feel like I do, the intention behind what you're doing here.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, all right, I'm gonna take the reins. So, the name of your podcast, Boundaries and Belonging. I'm curious to know, what does belonging look like to you, Magdalena, and what do boundaries look like to you in the classroom, as an educator, as an art therapist?
Well, I guess I'll start with boundaries. As somebody who is highly sensitive and navigates kind of deep empathy, boundaries can be really challenging. The conversation that has happened over many episodes around the different roles of being like teacher versus therapist and how to hold them in the classroom, that is something that I've navigated with challenges over the last decade plus as an educator in higher ed. There's these parts of me that feel really deeply, when my students are in a lot of pain. And so it's that the choice points around how to support rather than enable, when is no appropriate, when is yes appropriate, those places show up so often when working as an educator in therapeutic arts programs, because we're navigating such deep territory all the time. We're writing reflection papers about how X, Y, and Z impacts you, right? We're asking folks to create artworks sometimes about some traumatic relationships, about family relationships, about, who they are, about their identity, which of course is always evolving. And so it's like waves, it's like this movement, this constant movement when working with humans to figure out what is the boundary, what is my role. I know that what's the most helpful is for me to speak to that, to speak to, hey, I'm feeling you. I'm feeling that things are showing up in ways that are making it hard for you to follow through with an assignment. How can I accommodate? And these are the limits. It has to be in by this time. It needs to be focusing on this, whatever the assignment is. So, but boundaries show up in so many different ways in the classroom, right? From like how our body boundaries how close we are in proximity, if we're in person, the choices that I make as a facilitator around, yes, we can dive into what this one person brought up that's a bit of a tangent, or no, we are not going to do that and I have to compassionately interrupt you, right? It's quite it's a dance, teaching.
How do you discern that of when to go down that tangent versus when to not to? And I'm hearing, of course, the external boundary, reminding or expressing, but within that, the internal kind of gauge of where your boundaries are located that day and what feels maybe where you are versus what is maybe how it evolves or how it shifts day to day in and out of the classroom.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
It does. That's a great question because it maybe there is some shifts day to day, right? Depending on what's happening, what I'm bringing with me, I think, and that's an important piece, right? How am I regulating my nervous system? What am I bracketing off so that I am not dissociating into another storyline, right? And the practicing of presence really is, I think it's just the most important practice to orient to my body, to the environment, to breath, and then orienting to the group. I mean, it's like this practice of like checking in with what's happening with the group, which sometimes, right, sometimes that might be a projection and sometimes that might be intuition, right? Somebody's body language that may be closed off and cranky looking might have nothing to do with the classroom. And so there really is a lot of discerning, and yet as the facilitator of the space, I can feel into whether other folks are present or not, right? Is this tangent that's coming in serving the whole group, or is it serving this one person? And if it's serving this one person, then my goal is to see them, to communicate that I see them, and then to redirect it to the group. And it is this interesting, like, ooh, where am I? Where am I? Where are you? What are we doing here? What's the goal today? What time is it?
How do you do that? How do you express that? Hey, I see you. Thank you. And
I mean, it's some of that language. It's like that's a really interesting thing that you're bringing up. We can't deepen into that right now. I can say this about it, and let's move towards this. And if somebody, sometimes there are students that maybe it's that day, maybe it's a consistent thing, just have this. It's like act hunger, we'd call it act hunger in psychodrama, a need to take up the space, to be seen, to be responded to. And some of the work is like helping them rein that in, and that can be done with the group norms that we talk about at the beginning of the quarter or the semester, and then reminders like let's remember that it's really important that we make sure that the space that we take up is not more or less, right, than anybody else. Like how do we take responsibility for how much space we take up? Oof, boy, I feel like that's a life learning.
Yeah, and I imagine, or it makes sense that it would facilitate belonging by validating where that person is or the embodied need to take up space or be noticed, and at the same time holding that boundary, which supports people in knowing where those limits are, and then it also offers up other space for other people to then come in and be a part of the group or part of community.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I hope so. That's an intention, an active intention. And over the last year of thinking about and exploring belonging, something that's shown up for me is that I believe that it's our responsibility to belong to ourselves. And that in the group space, our trust will be tested at times. Our heart will be impacted in different ways, and there'll be multiple opportunities to practice trust and to practice like entering into belonging. I'm feeling into the imperfection of belonging, that it's not necessarily a constant state, if that makes sense. And in the classroom, I do believe that boundaries, explicit boundaries, flexibility, follow through, accountability, that those are part of the, I guess, tenets of experiencing belonging in the classroom. And I believe that the art process too is a big part of that, right? So expressing oneself, feeling safe enough to deepen into expression and be seen in the process, that could be like, you know, really messy, or really small, or anywhere in between or outside. So being seen in that process, especially if you're in person, obviously it's different if we, you know, are meeting online, and then having the opportunity to share or to say no to sharing, all impact the experience of belonging for the students and for the teacher. I mean, I think that that's kind of an interesting wondering too, is what are the expectations around belonging for the teacher? And I think that they're often pretty implicit until there's a rupture, you know, until perhaps there's something that the educator has, maybe it's something that I've done in the group that caused harm. And when that rupture happens, there's an experience of like, well, do I belong here? Am I doing this right? Am I meant for this work? You know, and I think that those questions can be echoed on the other side too, when someone doesn't necessarily feel like they belong in the class or in the program.
Mm-hmm. The distance, the self-doubt. And then what does it look like then to, you know, how does maybe repair help create a deeper sense of belonging?
Yes. Oh my gosh, what an important process. That's where the accountability comes in. And you know, that part can be hard for anyone on either side of the power dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Or when you talk about belonging to ourselves, even with our value system, or how we gauge what that accountability looks like, how do we come back to ourselves and that belonging through that self-doubt or shame or guilt, that rupture, and then that repair, whether it's with the community, the class, the teacher, or ourselves. I'm curious about why boundaries and why belonging. Where did this come from? What led you down this inquiry? And in your previous sessions or episodes, you talk a lot about heartbreak and heartache. And I'm curious if heartache and heartbreak has something to do with the inquiry.
Absolutely. Gosh,
Okay.
You know me well.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so as a student and as an educator, I have experienced heartbreak. As a student and as an educator, I have witnessed heartbreak being experienced. That there's been a range of examples. And what my experience and the understanding of the experience of others has been that rupture, especially when it's not repaired with humility or not repaired at all, deeply impacts belonging. And when a teacher's boundaries or students' boundaries are incredibly rigid, like they're not even boundaries, right? They're borders or they're walls. When they're incredibly rigid, it's very difficult to have repair. It's very difficult for accountability to show up. And so that flexibility around boundaries, I believe, is important, as well as direct communication around mistakes or accountability. I can think of facilitators that I've had that I didn't feel safe in their group or in their classroom because there were no boundaries, right? There were no group norms. Things were just they weren't witnessing what was happening in the group dynamic. And, you know, I will say that I do have a bit of hypervigilance when it comes to tracking, tracking the group. And I'm sure that's rooted in me making sure I'm safe, right? It's this practice, like what's happening with every single person in this group all the time. And I do that, and I've done that as a student and as an educator. And so part of my work is like reining that shit in, letting people have their feelings, not being a caretaker, people pleaser all the time, or at least, part of the time. So, that's where it comes from. It comes from students who have had experiences with teachers who can't see them, whether it's because of their identity, their background, their neurodivergence, their, mental health challenges. Their teacher doesn't see them, pathologizes them, tries to get them to fit into a box, doesn't work. And so I've had many students come to me for consultation around experiences with other educators. And sometimes that bridge work is really challenging, and so coming into a place that speaks to being here for the healing, when those things show up, it's like a smack in the face. It's like, wait a minute, aren't we here to heal? Isn't that what we're doing here?
Right. And so it makes me think about when you talk about that bridging or maybe that advocacy that you've had to do previously as another educator, kind of that lateral conversation to support maybe a student. It makes me think about how you view your responsibilities as an educator, or how they've evolved and changed, and perhaps how this whole inquiry that you are investigating, where does the question about responsibility come into play?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's like one of the most important questions. When I started my doctoral work, my question was, what is safety? And then it shifted to, what are my responsibilities as an educator? Or what are the responsibilities as an educator? Part of that shift is because the experience of safety is so multifaceted and influenced by so many factors that we can't, as educators, as folks in power positions, assume safety of anybody, the experience of safety in a group. Like, that's just not something that we can assume. And so, when I think about my responsibilities, it comes back to the conversation earlier about boundaries. It's my responsibility to have boundaries, and to be, to be clear about what my boundaries are as a facilitator, as an educator, as a human. And it's my responsibility to also be me, to be human, to, be clear when I make mistakes and really try to interrupt mistakes and biases that are harmful in the moment. And if not in the moment, in the next moment. And if not in the next moment, et cetera, et cetera. Those feel like really important responsibilities. And the discernment that I have been, navigating, again, comes to letting people have their feelings. It's my responsibility to not feel for other people. That's a really big one. I think in my life, it's a really big one. And, that when I haven't had that boundary, and it's a boundary, absolutely, that I continue to practice, that's when my people pleasing behavior might come out. When I am taking responsibility for other people's experiences and feelings, there's probably many things that I'm enabling. It's kind of disempowering, right, for the other person.
It's rooted in codependence too, and I mean, also, as an educator in a creative therapeutic field, it makes sense that you also have to model what it's like to be present with a person's feelings, and honor it while not internalizing it or taking it and shifting it into something that really is more about yourself or us rather than them. So it's what I'm hearing you say is like it's for you. It's a part of your value system and the way that you identify your responsibilities as a human, but also an educator. But it's also for modeling and kind of supporting the students. And like this might be what a healthy internal or external boundary looks like for holding heavy emotions or stories, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as educators in these programs, we are models. We're models for what it can look like to be a teacher, right? And also what it can look like to be a therapist, and so we can't, as educators in therapeutic arts programs, we can't let go completely of the therapeutic part of ourselves because we're modeling active listening. We're modeling compassionate interrupting, right? And reflection. And so they're inextricably woven.
Totally. I mean, I think about how I show up, I'm pretty new into the field, and I think about how I often show up with some of my clients, and I feel like I directly pull from some of the ways that you've modeled that feel aligned with kind of my values or how I want to show up, or the intention and care, while also the gentle boundary. And it feels great because I feel empowered in how I show up with my client, and it feels supportive and gentle and honoring while still containing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that gesture, honoring and containing. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, so, we're talking a little bit about your responsibilities as a teacher, the boundaries you hold. And I'm curious to know, just on kind of a big picture scale, how you view yourself as an educator and how you moved from art therapy into somatic experiencing, into expressive arts therapies. What's kind of like your overall philosophy? Big, broad question.
Yeah.
But I'm curious.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's see. I believe that we are all creative beings. Each one of us has access to creativity, and it can show up in lots of different ways. I believe that our bodies hold all of the answers, even when they have been the site of trauma, even when they are potentially the site of dysphoria, our bodies hold the wisdom. And then I guess the third tenet is love. Love and connection is a practice, and it's ultimately the most important communication. Whether it's towards myself, towards you, towards the group, towards the world, towards the earth, it's an important practice and form of communication that I believe deeply in. I believe it's more important than grades. It's an important aspect of how we can be together, and I really believe that the way that we are together ripples out to the way we are with others and the way they are with others, et cetera, et cetera. I really do believe that we all have big impact. And that's one of the reasons why I love teaching, because I believe in the power of love. I believe in the power of, supporting folks to root into their bodies, and then to externalize through movement or, visual arts expression or sound, to know oneself deeper and to connect to others even more authentically. And so all of those pieces are really important aspects of how I teach and why I teach. I believe that teaching is social justice work, both from like a love perspective, but also from like being able to speak directly about things that are challenging, whether it's, race, age, ableism, one's sexuality, one's trauma history, like being able to bring some of those things out in community is social justice work. And in terms of, my own journey as an educator, before I went to Southwestern College for my master's in art therapy and counseling, I've always worked with families and kids and in schools. So there's always been an aspect of teaching in the work that I've done really since I was a kid. You know, an art therapy and counseling program is just a jump off, right? You learn a lot, and then you learn like, wow, there's just so much more to learn, right? And I first fell in love with psychodrama. Kate Cook was my psychodrama professor at the time, and through working with her, I fell in love with somatics. And I realized, oh my gosh, I have this body that is magical and intuitive and holds a lot of pain. And how do I communicate through and with it more? And was when I got into somatic experiencing. I started that program, I think my last year as a graduate student, and deepening my understanding of the nervous system, deepening my understanding of the different ways that we hold, we release, we soothe or don't, has informed my humaning, you know, my humaning as a human in this world, as a mama, as a partner, as a daughter, as a sister, as a friend, and also my work as an educator. You know, our bodies are our tools in our life, you know, and in our work. And so the discernment that I was talking about earlier in terms of like, you know, where are these boundaries around like how I feel you and what I do with that is part of that work, you know. And then from there, you know, I've been trained in sand play, loving like working with symbol, like 3D symbol and metaphor and story, you know, that doesn't have to be verbal. I mean, there's so much work that we can do that where we don't actually have to narrate the story to heal what's happening, which is kind of exciting, you know, because sometimes narrating, not always, you know, of course, but sometimes narrating the story just kind of either deadens it or keeps like re-traumatizing the system. So how do we use story, play, symbol, movement to access other parts of the story and to access other ways to heal, you know, what needs to be healed? And then, you know, I was teaching probably for about 5 years, and I felt really good about it. I'm like, I'm a great teacher, and I feel like I've hit the ceiling. How do I get better? And that's why I went to the European Graduate School to start their postgraduate program in Expressive Arts, and then to continue on with doctoral work. I wanted to learn different ways to be expressive, and I wanted to learn different ways to facilitate. And I also have wanted different opportunities to teach that are experiential based, not as academic. You know, not a lot, we're not grading. Sure, there's assessment, but we're not like, you know, following rubrics. I'm not as interested in that anymore. You know, over especially the last few years of teaching, I realized I just got more of a visceral understanding of the colonial practices of higher ed, right? From grading to gatekeeping to professionalism, and how so much of that is rooted in white supremacy. So much of that is rooted in perfectionism. I just don't want to do that anymore, you know, which is part of the reason why I left working in that environment specifically. I am still an educator. I offer workshops in all kinds of ways for community health consultation work for organizations that reach out, that are looking for team building, that are looking for cultural competency work, etc. And I also teach at Kint Institute, which is a postgraduate program in New York focused on trauma training through the creative arts. And I do the, you know, symbol and metaphor art therapy module. So, you know, it's like figuring out different ways to facilitate and to be in a collaborative space where we are, you know, the teacher and the students are working together. We're learning together. You know, while I may have more experience in these ways, the experience of the group is just as valuable. So I guess that's another important aspect of my teaching philosophy, is that, you know, the more that I can lessen the power dynamic through clear communication, through my accountability and humility, and really empowering the voice of the group, empowering the voice of the individuals of the group, I think the better.
Mm-hmm. You touched briefly on humility, and so it makes me curious about what your relationship is with humility, how that's evolved. And you also touched upon gatekeeping, and I'm curious about what that negotiation has been like for you as you talk about maybe some of the disillusionment of maybe certain academic spaces, and wanting to kind of those feeling out of alignment, how gatekeeping has evolved. I can assume that maybe gatekeeping, there's a relationship there. Yeah, so I'm curious about both of those aspects as well, what that's like for you.
Yeah, thank you. Humility is connected to presence. It's connected to facilitating with love. It's connected to accountability. As a curriculum developer, I have been driven to like, how do I keep bringing in more voices, more perspectives? How do I keep making sure that this course offers a huge spectrum of belief and experience, so that the students can and I can continue to expand our perspective on life. You know, I really encourage myself, the folks that I accompany, no matter what the context is, to explore deeper our biases around what is health, what is relationship, what is love, and how our biases around these concepts and others can impact how we see, you know, or hear, or how we are in relationship, where our fears are, where our lack of experience is. And, you know, that all of that is in humility. And I think that humility gets impacted when we are, or gets hindered when we are in fear. And so part of the practice is to reduce fear, to notice it, to not dismiss it or numb it, to hear it and reduce it, so as to be able to be more present, you know, once again. I just really believe that all of our abilities to be present in the moment helps us interrupt bias. Rhonda McGee has a really great book about this in particular, how mindfulness is the work to interrupt harm, to interrupt bias, to interrupt racism. Because the more connected we are with how our body and mind are moving and working, the more able we are to interrupt, you know, to do that meta work inside of ourselves. And that's a humility practice. And then, you know, that is directly related to gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is a pretty controversial term in our field and other fields. I mean, there's like the huge swing of spectrum. Like, yes, of course I'm a gatekeeper, to like, holy shit, let them all in, you know? And both ends of the spectrum are problematic. One of the things that I've learned through all of these interviews, reminded that the role of gatekeeping is related to public good. And yet, gatekeeping itself is mired with bias. And the gatekeepers are mired with bias. And so how do we actually make these decisions when we have power roles, right? And it's from grading in the classroom. I mean, even before that, right? It's creating the curriculum. It's deciding on what the assignments are. It's, you know, being in conversation about rubrics. What does grading actually mean when we know that it's rooted in colonialism? You know, so there's that, like how we grade is gatekeeping. and then how we assess the student, the conversations that we have with the student versus the conversations that we have with maybe a student success team or other colleagues or the department chair about that student, right? What are the ways that we support students and why? It's just all of those pieces. And then, of course, what does it mean to be an arts-based therapist? What does that look like? What are the characteristics? And are all of those characteristics that are assumed or expected, are they culturally relevant? Are they culturally relevant for the therapist in training? Are they culturally relevant for the potential future clients? So I say all that to say that it's complicated, and the responsibility in power positions of doing that humility, presence, interrupting of bias work is necessary. And if we don't do that work, then we will cause harm. Mm-hmm. So no matter what kind of power position you're in, we all have some sort of power position, some of us more than others, of course. And, the less internal space we have, the more potential harm we can cause, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think listening through your podcast episodes, the understanding of gatekeeping, as you expressed earlier, being framework for being in service of public good or doing little harm, or is it supportive for maybe this student, et cetera, to move forward, engage with the public in this way? Do they have the capacity to handle it? Can they regulate their own emotions, et cetera? And then, so that makes the most sense to me. And then at the same time, it's how much do we really know? And what kind of work are they going to be doing? And where does our own bias come into play of what is gauged or deemed to be healthy or appropriate versus what is not, and why? And
yeah.
Gray area.
Very, very gray.
So much gray area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you've talked about kind of love being a root reason for doing this work. And you've also talked about in previous episodes when the third comes into play, whether that is with all of your students making art and sharing in that process, or whether it's or the art perhaps being that third, or working directly with a client. And it makes me curious about if love is kind of that third for you, or where love kind of weaves into that understanding of the third, or what's your awareness of the third as an educator with your students?
I think that's a beautiful wondering, because I think that love is a practice, and I think that love also emerges like the third, right? That it's this new way, but love isn't a new way, but it can be a new way. My experience of the third is awe. It's when we're in the group together and it's like we all connect at the same moment in a similar way. That's maybe one way it shows up. I can think about when something happened on the political landscape in the US that was draining and felt disorienting and disheartening to my group of students. And they all came into the class. This was before COVID. They all came into the class just heavy and having trouble being present to our class about ethics. And except that it was really relevant. But so instead of kind of pushing forward with the day's plan, I asked folks to drop into their bodies. I asked folks to do some sculptural work, which really is one of my most favorite things, is to do body sculpture work with groups. And so folks, the whole group represented how they felt. So you would see folks sitting on the floor, head held. You'd see folks leaning up against the wall, with their head covered. Everybody was separate and isolated. And then my request was just change one thing about your position, about how you're holding your body, to move towards what you want. And we did that maybe like 5 times, right? Like choose one more thing. And by the end of it, this group of humans, they were like in a circle, either holding hands or hugging and looking at each other. And they went from like isolation and despair to connection and love. And it was incredible. Now, saying it out loud, yes, of course, we want to go to connection from isolation. Yes, like, yes. And the movement towards, right, taking that next best step, as a former advisor of mine, Marcus Alexander, would say, Dr. Marcus Alexander, what is the next best step? And each movement, they became closer and closer. And while being together in a circle in a loving way, in connection, wasn't something that had never been experienced before, which is, some of what's been written about the third, right? It's this emergence of a new, that love and connection wasn't exactly new in their experience, but it was new in that moment, right? In comparison to what the whole group came in with. Oh, wow. It was incredible. I mean, tears and chills and just a real honoring of that whole process, of how important it is to be with what is, and also to make choices towards what you want or what could be.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, in creative arts or expressive arts therapies, or at least in art therapy, there's the process versus product, and it makes me think about the third as being both process and product. The third being that cathartic, sometimes connection or that release. And with this example you gave, that evolution into connection and solidarity and perhaps hope even amongst the grief being the third, but also the gradual evolution and within each new gesture or that the next best step being that third as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the process is the emergence, I appreciate that reflection because both are important. How we get there and where we are. Yes. And then also sometimes what we do with it, right? What we do with that third, whether we record it, rip it up, forget it, that part's important too. How do we integrate this newness? And also maybe how do we let go of it?
Right. Yeah, super important. Does it need to be purged? Or how do we want to integrate it? Mm-hmm. Well, I know a good bit of what you're like as a professor, and I'm curious to know more about materials in your classroom. What has been the most exciting or tantalizing or potent for you? How has it evolved and shifted over the years versus also just as a expressive arts therapist as well? How does that shift? And also with COVID, because I was also a student with you prior to COVID and then during lockdown and all of that.
You were.
Mm-hmm. I have a very vivid memory of we ended winter's quarter ended, and I remember being like, I don't know, and then lo and behold, a week later everything's fully shut down. We're all in our homes in New Mexico, and I remember being on Zoom and you setting up the camera and looking back and just seeing all the faces, and it's just etched into my brain. And I don't know, at some point, I think talking about belonging within that whole realm is interesting as well.
Ooh,
but
it is.
Materials.
Yes. Okay. Let's see. Well, I love options. I guess I vacillate between the directives that I facilitate are either you have so many options or this is what you're going to use. And generally I err on the side of lots of options because I think that it's interesting for folks to play with what they want to play with. And sometimes students will choose what they know and what feels comfortable. And sometimes on purpose, they'll choose things that make them uncomfortable, that materials that they don't want to use. You know, I really, still at Southwestern College, there is a box on top of one of the filing cabinets that has all kinds of found objects from my home. Broken toys, wires and things, you know, because I would just collect all kinds of things that you can glue together to create sculptures. And that's definitely a favorite material, and different processes that we would do with found objects, like creating a character. It could be related to anything, right? It could be a self-critic. It could be, you know, a superhero. It could be a specific archetype that they're exploring. But creating a character from all of these random bits would always elicit strange and interesting pieces that, you know, usually students are like, wow, I would never have imagined that this would come out of me. And it's really powerful. I'm going to take it to therapy, you know? So that's something that I have really enjoyed and cherished because of the how dynamic it can be, you know, and figuring out how to put together broken bits of things to make something that's whole, you know, and how to balance it and how to wrap it or use glue, and the metaphor and the process of that movement. I really, you know, that's another piece that I do love weaving into the work that I do with students and with clients, is to track the process of creating. What are the steps that you took? What are the choices that you made, and what's the metaphor in there? And I was introduced to that by Josie Abinante many years ago at a workshop, and it just rings so true that our decision-making process in the creative process reflects something about us, you know, that can be so enlightening and really interesting, you know, whether we smash stuff together or work very small and slowly, or anywhere in between or outside. There's just so much, there's so many choices that we can make that speak to who we are. And I love to invite students to attend to that, to offer another opportunity to deepen. And then, you know, murals outside. Love to really be a part of the process of short-term mural making, where it starts with a blank wall and 5 hours later there's a full piece that 4 or 5 people created together, and they didn't know exactly what they were going to do 2 days prior. Like that's like the third two, right? Like just this emergence of something on a wall, where folks have to navigate differing opinions or wants. Sometimes it's really hard to let go of control around what things are going to look like and make room for other people's thoughts and ideas. Or sometimes it's hard to step forward and to take up space. And other times it works. The synchronicity of the group is superb. You know, it just kind of really depends on what that group soul needs. And other than that, I love large pieces of paper that, like, just, you know, that whole roll, you just roll it down the floor and everybody gets on that and we're working on something. It doesn't really matter, but everybody's on the paper, moving around. Maybe they have one spot they stay on the whole time. Maybe they're moving from spot to spot on this really long paper. And just that large expression can be so satisfying for the whole group. And then the last thing that I'll say is facilitating the zine process in the ethics class for multiple years, supporting students in identifying something that they feel strongly about, that they're willing to or want to speak publicly about, right? So the zine process, we decide on an issue or an experience that folks will put into a zine in whatever way they want. It could be images, just images. There could be words. You know, some students would put tools in it, like how to regulate your nervous system. Some folks, you know, would talk, like, it'd be existential exploration or a personal story about, you know, a family member's struggle and mental illness, right? So just a wide array. And after they create the zine, they decide where they're going to share it. So students would create a digital copy and do an email blast or put it on social media. They would put it on the floor of a bathroom in a gas station, or I've had students put them in like soda and beer holders.
6-packs
Yeah,
or whatever.
exactly. Or leave it on park benches, or bring it to doctor's offices or whatever. Like, and then receive. Sometimes they wouldn't receive feedback because of where they'd put it, and sometimes they would. And then they'd reflect on this whole process. What is it like to create something about what they believe and share it with strangers? And what is the role of public advocacy as a therapist is really the point of that project. So yeah, just so many ways to play and to learn.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's easy to see why community work, social justice work, and these lenses being so integral for your work. There's an expansiveness, whether it's like a large amount of offerings as materials, or whether, mural making, historically very community-based, zine making, historically pretty punk, community-based, large just swaths of paper where community comes together to create something. It's hearing you talk about the zines, it brought back really good memories. And then I just feel the bubbliness in my solar plexus of, it's reminding me that I need to, as I'm building out my practice, the importance of carving out some time. And I've been thinking about it, but it just feels more verified now to be engaging in that kind of work and how important it is. And there's this really cool radical joy to it.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming up towards the end of our time. But so I guess to close out, Magdalena, I'm curious to know what's next. You will be completing your PhD program, I imagine, fairly soon, or whenever you do. You're still an educator. I'm curious about what academia looks like for you in the future. I can't imagine that you entirely have an idea. Still teaching at Kent, but what do you envision? What sounds good?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, usually when folks are like, what asks a similar question, I'm like, traveling the world, it's usually my response. I want to be invited to different places around the world to collaborate creatively, to facilitate workshops, to create art installations with other people. I want to learn more from others with a more of a global perspective. Going to the European Graduate School is such a great choice. Granted, not everybody is represented. Having a international experience as a student was just so important to my inner expansion, and I'd like more of that. I've been hired by multiple organizations in New Mexico, where I'm located, as well as throughout the country, to facilitate workshops, around somatic awareness, around cultural humility, belonging, heartache, the ethics around all of these things. So I imagine that will happen more. I do love facilitating. I facilitate online and in person, and in person I do like better. And, sometimes it's a little harder to make happen, right? And I also imagine that, these next 4 to 6 years are really important in my children's lives. I have a teenager and a preteen, and so I need to be conscientious of how I'm moving in time and in place, so that I am available for them. First, I think prioritizing my profession has been big for me, and there's some loss in that when it comes to family. So I'm figuring out, how do I balance these things? How do I be a world traveler or a national traveler as well, and still be here to support my kids through all the things, So, yeah. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, it sounds really good. More gray area.
Yeah. More gray area. Thanks so much, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Again, super, super honored and grateful to be here, and grateful I got to ask you all these questions that I've been listening to you ask all these other educators.
Yeah, I feel seen and just loving being in a mutual, respecting, loving relationship with you as another awesome human in this world.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you for listening to the Boundaries and Belonging podcast, an arts-based approach. Please tune in, subscribe, follow. We're on Instagram at Boundaries Belonging Podcast. I want to thank today's guest for their wisdom, laughter, and movement, and also a big thanks to my brother Gabriel Karlick, who's in charge of the music. See you soon, and keep creating.